It's been a while. 2023 was a pretty hectic year for me. As you'll see in future episodes of Kirby and the Battle for Dreamland, I moved from my old house of 9 years. So it's been quite a transition for me. Also dealing with finding a job, personal issues, creative strut, and the YouTube curse known as procrastination, it's been pretty hard trying to make new videos. And the one I did make didn't do as well as I hoped. I want to make it a goal this year to make more videos of different quality. Whether it be plush videos, countdowns, montages, etc. I want to try making videos on a more consistent basis. But you're probably not here to listen to me rant about life, so let's talk about some video games. 2023 was a pretty great year for video games. And while I admittedly didn't play a lot of new games, the ones I did play were pretty awesome for the most part. And I did manage to play 10 of them. Even if some of them are from the same franchise, but I digress. It should be obvious, but there will be some spoilers for all of these games. I'll try not to spoil too much though. But enough with the intro, let's get this video started. The first game on the list is the Super Mario RPG Remake, which many people have cited the original as one of the best Mario RPGs ever. And yet despite that, this is the first time I've played it. Oops. At the time of writing this, I haven't gotten very far. I'm still in the early game. But from what I've played so far, it's good. Nothing that's blown me away, but it's a good time overall. The gameplay is solid, the characters are interesting, both allies and enemies, which shouldn't seem like a big deal, but yeah. Admittedly though, it can be a bit of a slog to get through. I'll have to play more of it to see how I feel about it as a whole, but if it's anything like Sea of Stars, I'll probably like it. So yeah, this segment is kind of a cop-out. Yeah. That's it. So, this one is a weird one for me. Sonic Dream Team is actually a pretty good game for being an Apple Arcade exclusive. The levels are well designed, the multiple playable characters are a welcome addition, Cream especially, and the story, while simple, is one of the better written stories in the series. And it has a pretty great finale. That being said, I have some issues with it. Since it's a mobile game, it has that repetitive gameplay loop that a lot of mobile games are known for. I'm happy to say this is one of the better examples of it, but even with that in mind, it can get old fast. Also, while not a huge deal for others, for me, the game felt too easy. Definitely fun, but it felt more like a kid's first Sonic game. Like, it's a lot more forgiving if you mess up. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, I just like my games to be a little more challenging nowadays. The boss fights are also kinda underwhelming barring the final boss. So, yeah, some of my issues are more of a personal preference, but it's still a good game, and it's probably the only reason you would even consider getting an Apple Arcade subscription. At least, I assume. For me, mobile games are just repetitive and not very interesting nowadays. Anyone remember Infinity Blade? No? Okay, moving on. But we're not done with Sonic just yet. Let's talk about Sonic Superstars, cause oh boy, have I got feelings about this one. For the most part, Sonic Superstars is a good game, but the issues it has are glaring, to say the least. The core gameplay is actually pretty solid. It's definitely the best 2D Sonic has controlled in a 3D animated game. In classic Sonic fashion, there are multiple playable characters, and they're all fun to play as. Except for Knuckles, because of course he isn't. Each character has their own unique abilities, which makes tackling a level with each character feel unique. Speaking of the levels, they're for the most part really good. Some of them can be kind of frustrating due to their gimmicks, but the majority of them are really fun and creative. The second level has you grinding on vines, which is pretty cool. One cool thing about this game are the Emerald powers. Each Chaos Emerald now has its own unique power, which I really like. I mean, some of them are completely freaking useless, but there are some really cool ones as well, and they can make your adventure a lot easier. Which brings me to easily the most controversial part of the game, the bosses. And for good reason. Some of them are kinda cool, but most of them are either a slog to get through, or really, really frustrating. For context, there are 3 different final bosses, and I hated every single one. It definitely makes Sonic Frontier's final bosses look like masterpieces by comparison. The soundtrack is pretty forgettable. It has some nice tracks, but nothing that really sticks out. I guess I could say Sonic Superstars is more of a good game than a bad one, but the issues it has keeps it from being any better. That being said, it's a step in the right direction for the franchise, and hopefully when they make another 2D Sonic game, they'll take these criticisms to heart and refine it to perfection. Until then though, Sonic Superstars is still a good time. So, the general consensus for Sea of Stars seems to be all over the place. From some people loving it, to others finding it disappointing. Me personally, yeah, I like this game. A lot. Honestly, I think it's better than Super Mario RPG. I have a feeling that's going to be a very controversial opinion. I found the battle system to be really fun, with there being a lot of creative team attacks. A lot of the enemies are pretty cool as well. The bosses in particular were really cool. And while it can make some fights really easy, I liked the lock break system. It encourages you to strategize a lot more so that you don't get completely demolished. Now as for the story, I really liked it. It's not the most complex story ever, granted, but I liked the characters, I understood their motives, and every time you think it's almost over, the game throws a crazy twist at you. And I know some people find Garl to be insufferable, but I liked him. He kinda reminds me of Sora in a way. As for the technical stuff, the graphics are stunning. The sprites are really well done, and the environments all stand out from each other. And then there's the soundtrack, which I think is fantastic. Both area themes and battle themes are instantly memorable for me. Honestly, the only issues I really have with the game is that it can be kinda easy, especially once you've got the lock break system down. Some of the story choices are a little odd and underwhelming, and for me at least, the game is more of a one-time experience. But man, what a one-time experience it was. I'll definitely remember this game for a long time. And who knows, I may revisit this game in the future. But as of right now, I'm satisfied with my experience. So, this next game is the reason I haven't played much of Mario RPG. Yeah, I didn't think I would play a Fire Emblem game over a Mario game, but here we are. Fire Emblem has always been a weird series for me. Since all the times I tried to get into it, it never really hooked me. That is until Three Houses, which I can still confidently say is one of my favorite games of all time. So you'd think I would have given Engage a shot when it came out, but all the mixed opinions on it pushed me away for a while. The general consensus on the game seems to be great gameplay, mediocre story. And after playing it myself, I can agree with that. The gameplay of Engage is some of the best in the whole series, and that comes down to the main gimmick, the emblems. There are different emblems you get throughout the game that really shake up the formula, giving you new ways to approach a map and encouraging different strategies. You're also able to give your units some of the emblem's abilities if your bond is high enough, and the higher the bond, the more powerful you get. On the topic of units though, the characters for the most part are good. Not necessarily to the point of Three Houses, that's kind of a hard thing to top, but there were some characters that I grew really fond of. Whether it's because of their personalities, or because they're just an unstoppable force on the battlefield. Pro tip, use Kagetsu as soon as you get him. Trust me. Most of the villains are also some of the better villains in Fire Emblem, with the Four Hounds being the obvious standouts. Now, as for the story, it's fine. Like, it's not as offensively bad as some people make it out to be, but it's nothing really that special outside of a few moments. And while there are some twists in the story, most of them are pretty predictable. So yeah, while the story isn't that great, I'd say the gameplay alone makes this worth playing. Also, the soundtrack is way better than I thought it'd be. I'm not really sure what I was expecting, honestly, but it's a very good soundtrack. Some standouts being Bloom in the Breeze and Tear Street. Unfortunately, there's no New Game Plus, but with the DLC that followed soon after that added new emblems and an ultimate story, albeit with an arguably worse story than the main game, I'd say this game definitely has some replay value. I would consider this one of the better entries in the series, if only because the gameplay is so good, but that's just me. What's there to say about Metroid Prime that hasn't already been said? It's an incredible game that reinvents the Metroid gameplay to create something truly special. The remaster is basically the same game, but much prettier. Admittedly, the controls took me a little bit to get used to since I've only played the Wii version, but once I did, it felt so good to revisit Town 4 in glorious HD. People have sung the praises of Metroid Prime before, so let's just cut to the chase. Metroid Prime Remastered is by far the best way to play this game. So if you haven't played it before, I highly recommend checking it out. And who knows, we could see remasters of 2 and 3 down the road. Or, you know, Metroid Prime 4. That would be nice. Well, it's about time we got a 2D Mario game that was unique. I think it goes without saying that Super Mario Bros. Wonder is one of the most creative games in the franchise. The level design is the best it's ever been, the new power-ups are awesome, the art style is expressive with every movement, and there are multiple characters to play as. You get to play as Daisy in a mainline Mario game, guys. This is a big deal. But of course, we can't forget about the gimmick that makes this game so creative, the Wonder Flower. The Wonder Flower changes up the levels drastically for a limited time, or until you collect its Wonder Seed, in some pretty bonkers ways. From pipes moving up and down, to a herd of Bull Rush, to transforming into a Goomba, and much more wacky effects. My favorite Wonder effect is actually in the second level of the game. I'm not going to spoil it here because it's truly a wonder to behold. Pun not intended. The amount of care and creativity put into this game is honestly incredible. It shows that Nintendo still has what it takes to make a great 2D Mario adventure. Unfortunately, however, the game's not without its faults, and they're pretty big ones admittedly. The multiplayer experience isn't nearly as fun as the new Super Mario Bros. Games, mainly because you can't interact with the other players at all, which was like half of the fun of multiplayer in those games in the first place. Being able to help each other out, or just sabotaging them, it really added to the multiplayer experience. Nothing says fun like losing friends, am I right? So removing that altogether makes multiplayer less fun. The online stuff is kinda neat, I guess, but nothing I ever bothered with. But by far, the most disappointing part of the game was the boss fights. For as creative as this game can get, you'd think the bosses would have the same level of creativity. But no. Instead, we fight Bowser Jr. 4 different times. You know, when people said they didn't want the Koopalings anymore, this is not what they meant. There's also these Mecha Bowser fights that are a homage to the classic Bowser fights from the first Super Mario Bros., which are kinda cool, but they get old fast. Not helped by the fact that they're all way too frickin' easy. Plus, it's kinda weird that some worlds don't have a castle level at the end, let alone a boss fight. But all in all, I'd say this game earns its reputation. It truly is one of the best Mario games out there. I've never been a big fan of the Zelda series. It just wasn't really my thing. And yet, despite that, I really enjoyed Breath of the Wild. Now granted, I wasn't in love with it or anything, and I didn't really acknowledge it for years. And by that, I mean I deleted the game and its save data. I have a complicated relationship with digital games, okay? But replaying Breath of the Wild in preparation for the sequel, I found that I liked it a lot more than I thought I did. So of course, that got me really excited to play Tears of the Kingdom. And after having played it, I can safely say that I kinda love it so much. I don't care what some people say. This game was freaking incredible. The gameplay is largely the same as Breath of the Wild. Open world exploration, expanded combat, lots of quests to do, etc, etc, etc. And Hyrule is almost exactly the same, barring a few changes. And yet, despite that, they did a lot to make this feel like a brand new experience. For one, you have brand new abilities thanks to Link's new arm. You can move and attach any type of objects, which leads to some pretty crazy builds. You can ascend through the ceiling, you can fuse your weapons with objects, and you can rewind moving objects. That last one can make for some pretty cool puzzles. There are 2 new layers of Hyrule to explore now, the sky and the depths. The Sky Islands act as mini challenges and or puzzles, while the depths are pitch black areas filled with gloom, as well as gloomified enemies. Both of these can be fun to explore, and it helps that there are various side quests you can do in both. On the topic of enemies though, there are a lot of new monsters to encounter that have a lot more variety. The Zonai constructs, boss bokoblins, Gibdos, Horriblins, and the terrifying monstrosity that is the Gloom Spawn. I don't know what was happening the first time I encountered these things, but I hated all of it. There's also more variety in the bosses and mini-bosses, which is much appreciated. Colgera in particular is a huge standout for its atmosphere and the incredible music. Now the story was actually a pleasant surprise. Without spoiling too much, the flashbacks are done super well, and piecing it all together is both satisfying and emotional. The main adventure also has more of a looming threat in the form of phenomenons. Each major region of Hyrule has their own unique phenomenons, which keeps things more interesting as you approach that region's temple. Now, the temples for the most part are done fairly well. There are some done better than others, of course. Personally, not a huge fan of the Fire Temple, but at least they have variety this time around. There are a few things I have issues with. While fun to traverse, the Sky Islands don't really offer a whole lot to do, which would be fine if it wasn't advertised so much. And despite being a sequel to Breath of the Wild, the game barely acknowledges the events of the first game in an attempt to be more beginner-friendly. There's almost no mention of the Sheikah tribe. All the shrines, towers, and divine beasts are gone without a trace. And Calamity Ganon is barely acknowledged, despite the fact that Ganondorf is the main antagonist. It makes the games feel disconnected from each other, even though they aren't, if that makes sense. Even with all that in mind, Tears of the Kingdom was an amazing experience from beginning to end. But it wasn't my favorite sequel from this year. So, while I wasn't excited for Tears of the Kingdom up until its release, Marvel's Spider-Man 2 was the sequel I was excited for just from the post-credits of the first game. To give some background, I'm a big fan of Spider-Man. He's without a doubt my favorite superhero of all time. And the Insomniac games, probably my favorite Spider-Man adaptation. Not only does it have one of the best stories in Spider-Man history, but the gameplay across all the games is just absolutely perfect. You really feel like Spider-Man as you swing across the city and fight off bad guys. Given how well done Spider-Man 1 and Miles Morales were, and how much they were setting up, the sequel had a lot to live up to. And given my placement of this game, for me at least, it more than lived up to the hype. Like with Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, the gameplay of Spider-Man 2 is very similar to the first two games, with New York City still being largely the same. But there are lots of changes and things added to the sequel that really make it stand out. Let's start with the gameplay. You play as Peter Parker and Miles Morales throughout different points in the game. In fact, you can switch between them with little to no wait time. Both Spider-Men, while similar in a lot of ways, have their own unique features. But more on that later. While you still have your standard web swinging, you also have web gliders. The controls for web gliding takes a little bit to get used to, but once you do, zooming through the city with them feels exhilarating. You could argue it feels out of place for Spider-Man to glide, but given how many adaptations have used web gliders, it's really not that out of place. The combat has also been tweaked a little. You have lots of new attacks and web tricks to mess around with. Yeah, you have fewer gadgets this time around, but to make up for that, you have abilities. Depending on what Spider-Man you're playing as, your abilities will be different, and you unlock new ones as the game progresses. Both your abilities and your web gadgets are now tied to specific buttons, rather than the rotating gadget wheel or being tied to the focus bar. How you grow stronger has also been tweaked. Instead of your stats automatically growing with each level, you get to choose what buffs you get, assuming you have the right parts. It's one of those you choose the difficulty things that a lot of games do nowadays, but I like how it's implemented here. I do miss the suit powers from the first game, and while the new gadgets are cool, they're not as experimental as they are in the first game. But those are just minor nitpicks in the grand scheme of things. Besides, now you have alternate suit colors, which I approve of. As for the story, I thought it was a great continuation. It manages to balance both Peter's and Miles' stories very well, and cleverly interweaves their paths throughout the game. They could even cross paths in gameplay, which is super cool. The main villains are also great. Without spoiling too much, Kraven the Hunter is an intimidating and calculating foe with a surprisingly interesting motivation, and Venom is a terrifying monster with a different kind of plan than most versions. Which, on that note, the main thing I was worried about with the story was how the symbiote arc was going to be done. But I can safely say that this is one of the best adaptations of the symbiote arc, easily on par with Spectacular Spider-Man's version. Now, even though I love this game's story, I'll admit that the direction they went with the third act was not what I was expecting, and even now I'm not sure how I feel about it. Also, Miles has a story costume near the end of the game that has not been received well by fans at all. As for the side content, it's really good. It does feel like there's not as much side content compared to the first game, and you can only replay one of them, but it's all still really fun, with one side story in particular being really cool. And the soundtrack is absolutely fantastic. probably my second favorite Spider-Man soundtrack. There's a lot more I want to say about the game, but part of the magic comes from experiencing it yourself. I had an absolute field day with this game, with so many moments being some of my favorite not just in Spider-Man, but video games as a whole. It's phenomenal, and I can't wait to play it again once New Game Plus is released. And while it's not number one, it's definitely my favorite original adventure from 2023. Yes, I'm aware of how not subtle that segue was. If it wasn't completely obvious by now, given how much I love the original game and made a montage of the game's bosses, my favorite game of 2023 is Kirby's Return to Dreamland Deluxe. Stay with me on this. I think I'm probably the only person who would even think about putting a Kirby game over games like Tears of the Kingdom and Marvel's Spider-Man 2. Not helping my case is that this game is a remake rather than an original adventure. And yet, despite all that, I couldn't care less. This was everything I wanted in a remake of my favorite Kirby game. The main adventure feels and looks better than ever, and all the new content is freaking fantastic. The new copy abilities are really good. They made sand fun, and the 10 new and returning minigames are really fun. You can also get these cute little masks from beating certain objectives in Merry Magoland, and you can wear them in every mode. Meta Knight is officially the greatest warrior in the galaxy. And then there's the new post-game mode, Magolor Epilogue. This is without a doubt my favorite extra mode in the series. Magolor plays similar to how he does in Star Allies, but he starts off really weak. Throughout the mode, you get magic points placed throughout a stage or by defeating enemies. There's also a combo system, and the more combos you rack up, the more magic points that you earn. The magic points are used to upgrade your abilities, and you'll unlock more abilities as you progress through the game. And the stronger your abilities get, the easier you can just decimate everything in your path. A lot of the stages you go through are original designs, while a few have you going through familiar levels in reverse while running from a dimensional wall. You also come across elemental variants of bosses you fought in the main game, and they're all really fun to fight. I could honestly gush about this mode for hours. It's so well crafted, and it's by far the most original extra mode in the series. Though on the topic of extra modes, the original extra mode has been tweaked to be made even more difficult, and the True Arena adds all the new bosses from Magolor Epilogue, as well as a harder final boss. Alongside all the music from the original game, there's a bunch of new songs as well, and they have quickly become some of my favorite tracks in the series. They also changed what tracks play where in certain parts of the game. The mini-boss tower has different tracks that play in both the main mode and extra mode. All the attention to detail, whether big or small, are incredible, and a lot of Kirby fans like myself will appreciate them. Honestly, the only real gripes I have with this game is that it's made a little easier than the original, and in order to play Magolor Epilogue, you have to beat the main mode, which isn't so much of a problem for new players, but for someone who's played the original many times, I literally just blasted through the main game to get to the new stuff. Other than that, I love this game so much. It's without a doubt my favorite Kirby game, my favorite remake, and easily my favorite game of 2023. And if you still don't understand my reasoning, that's not my problem.